Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Sirius Report. Well, Paul, whether it's Russia, India, and especially China, powerful nations not within America's sphere of control are defying Trump and playing hardball against nearly every one of his demands.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's got to the point where the more that nations are resistant to this, and we're going to focus on China initially in this discussion, uh, the more desperate Trump gets, the more he looks desperate, the more the world regards this as desperation. And also in the process, the Chinese reaction has shocked the Americans. And it shocked other nations because China's normally, whatever people's perception of it is, are quite reserved, quite calm, even when they're particularly angry about something. They're fairly kind of benign in the use of language. They don't use high octane rhetoric typically. There has been odd exceptions over the years, including the time when obviously the Chinese met the Americans in Alaska and they basically got furious and really very angry with the Americans, which shocked them then. But just to give one recent example of why China is playing hardball was the whole issue of Trump threatening the Indians and the Chinese with ridiculously high tariffs on the basis if you keep importing additional Russian oil, then we're going to sanction you. And the Chinese response, and then I'll put it diplomatically, was basically go away and don't talk to us in that condescending, patronizing, and totally irresponsible way. We're not tolerating it and don't expect us to do so. They were very, very vociferous, saying, you will never tell us as a sovereign nation what to do. I think it deeply shocked the Americans, who, as I said, normally would associate the Chinese as being quite reserved, even when they are particularly angry about something. They tend to say things in a very kind of circumspect way. But they didn't in that regard. And this is setting a precedent where China, in fact, is displaying more resistance to these US overtures than the Russians are. Even with regards to Russia's perspective on Ukraine and the comments and discussions they've had in recent weeks and months, they're still a lot more guarded and restrained in terms of vocalizing their displeasure at statements the United States may have made or have made in the context of trying to resolve the Ukraine war. But we're not discussing the Ukraine war today. But one thing that's very telling with regards to this whole issue of the United States and its relationship with China is the United States never took China seriously enough, from my perspective, with regards to its rise, its ascendancy. The US was always dismissive and perceiving China to be this backwater sort of provincial country who never really advanced past the 1970s, 1980s. Even, through the 2000s and in the first decade, they paid little attention. Now, the United States finally realizes that China's ascendancy is for real, and now they're panicking and they are threatening them, but in a way that's kind of a bit more measured than it was in the past because they're realizing the gravity of what China is as a nation. And in that regard, of course, there's this whole issue of rare earths where nobody inside the United States ever thought this through logically because they should have asked themselves, what do we need rare earths for? I know we've mentioned this before, but we're just mentioning it briefly, where they should have asked themselves, what do we need this for commercially and in terms of the military? And China has been very resolute in saying, well, we are refusing to grant permission for you to have rare earths and by extension magnets, which is used extensively in military applications. And that's it. There's no change of mind. We're not going to back off from this. It will take an awful lot for us to steer a different course, and that would require you, the United States, to behave in a responsible, adult-like way. So, what's Trump's response again? Tries to play hardball, tries to threaten them with tariffs, and came out with a statement which was rather ridiculous that, magnets weren't an issue and China made it a big issue. And if China continues to threaten us with not allowing us to have access to them, then I'm going to put 200% tariffs on Chinese goods. And China's turned around and gone, well, fine. I mean, do whatever the hell you like. Why not 500%? Because here's the thing, we're not paying for it. You, the United States, are paying for it via import duties, and then obviously retailers are having to pay for it. And now the retailers are all saying, well, sorry, we're going to have to pass all of the costs onto consumers, which creates a huge problem with respect to price inflation of goods. And in the process, of course, we're back to the whole issue of when the United States imposes a tariffs at a certain level, China responds in kind, which of course they do, and why the United States backed off and came up with this 90-day pause, which keeps being renewed, and claims of we've reached a deal. Oh, no, we haven't reached a deal. Yes, we've got a great deal. No, there's no deal in place. And China says, fine, if you put 200% tariffs on us, well, you'll pay for it. But you know what? We'll put 200% tariffs on your goods going into China. Oh, by the way, we're back to that problem again. You won't be exporting anything to us, which is why you backed off in the first place. You're going to have to back off again. And this demonstrates several things with regards to the Trump administration and the United States. Firstly, they've finally wised up to the fact that not having access to rare earths, to magnets, etc., is an enormous problem for them. Not least militarily, they can't produce any new military hardware or much of it. They've got some stockpiles and inventory left, but not an awful lot. And therefore, because they can't produce the military hardware, they're not able to support the likes of Ukraine, which is why they're trying to put all the onus on the Europeans. They can't support Israel, which is why the war between Israel and Iran ended after 12 days, because if it carried on for a couple more days, Israel would have been out of all weapons and would have been a total sitting duck against the Iranian missile strikes. Hence, the sudden desperation to get a truce in place to end the war. The United States is displaying militarily its enormous weakness, its enormous dependency on China. And it's also in the process displaying the fact that it is extremely weak. It is the emperor with no clothes. It is in no position to throw its weight around with China or with Russia for that matter, or any other country in the world anymore. It has finally been exposed, as it was for a very long time, to be an emperor with no clothes, to not actually be an hegemonic power, just perceiving itself to be an hegemonic power. And increasingly, not exclusively, China is demonstrating that they're calling the US's bluff, and the US has nothing to answer to in that regard. So it displays definitely that the Trump administration is deeply fearful of China. They're deeply fearful of the fact that they can't do anything to persuade China to change its mind. And why would China change its mind? And they're also looking at this going, well, people are looking at China and they will think, well, China's the hegemonic power now, because the US has to frame everything that there has to be an hegemonic power in the world, even though there doesn't and there won't be. But they have to perceive it that way because that's their mindset. So They're looking at this going, well, the world will see China as the hegemonic power and not us. And they see this as part of this slippage of unipolarity and its demise and the rise of multipolarity with China and not exclusively China, Russia, etc., as being at the forefront of this renaissance in world geopolitics.
To me, one of the biggest things that the Trump administration, especially President Trump, fails egregiously at is understanding cultures. Trump's response to everything is simply to throw a tantrum and make belligerent threats and demands. China, on the other hand, understands that behind closed doors, you can have very uh, tense and difficult negotiations. That's fine. But China is a proud, long-standing country, and insults, public insults, are the absolute worst thing that you can do for not just the leadership, but also the people. And, we're starting to see this around the world. America used to be the place that everybody strove to get to, go to for freedoms, for economic growth, prosperity, for dreams. And now most of the world doesn't want anything to do with the United States. But more and more, as they're going to visit China, they're seeing, my God, this is the future. And so it's kind of interesting from that aspect is really he doesn't have a lot of global support behind him. I'm talking Trump. And so what he has to do is, of course, make these threats and demands. He can get away with it with the milquetoast weak leadership of Europe. They have virtually no choice. They're already in more and more dire straits. But Russia, India, you've mentioned recently that he's been trying to contact Modi, and Modi refuses to take his calls. Why? Because of the threats and demands, simply to get his own way. And when you take a look at it, behind the scenes, the United States is in a point, and I don't think people understand just how um, important this suddenly this change of policy of we want to have 600,000 students, Chinese students coming to America and filling the universities. I mean, that just says right there, one, they don't have enough brain power in the American people to be able to move into the future. Two, they realized that if the foreigners left, then many of the universities, this whole big university system that's like a healthcare system unto its own, is going to collapse. And three, when you take a look at who is really doing the technology innovations, it hasn't been Americans. We can say, okay, Elon Musk, CEOs don't do the innovations. The H-1B Indians who have come here for the last 20 years, they did the innovations. The Chinese who have been here, they've done the innovations. And if you're going to kick them out of the country because you have this us versus them mentality, well, they're going to take all that brain power and you're going to see the nations like China start cutting us off from resources. Same thing with Russia. And where is America going to be from there?
Yeah, absolutely. And the issue of students is because, it's just simple maths. They need the foreign students. It's the same in UK universities. I mean, it's the same issue in Dutch universities because the student fees is a lot higher, but also these students live in these countries and they spend money in these countries. So it's good for economic growth. And how many foreign students are there in the United States? It's not a question I know the answer to, but it's obviously significant. And if they all spend, $20,000, $30,000 a year in the United States, well, then it starts to add up to be a significant amount of money. And the objective is if they treat these students well and treat their countries well, then instead of this brain drain going out of the United States, because again, Chinese students are not staying there or Chinese professionals working in the US are going home because they can't stand the attitude towards China itself. then that's a huge problem. So if the US wants to retain these students and help revitalize their economy technologically, etc., because they're going to need them, then they're going to have to treat the Chinese students better and China, by extension, better also. And this is something they're still not learning. And equally, Chinese people are very receptive to Beijing. If Beijing says boycott these products or boycott these universities for argument's sake, the Chinese students will do so en masse. And it's very easy to push brands out of China on the basis of the government voicing their displeasure. That's something else countries like the United States just do not understand. And therefore, on that basis, the US not only has to understand that China can play hardball, it can make life very, very difficult for the United States, and it's increasingly doing so. But also, it needs to understand that if it's going to build any meaningful relationship with China going forward, then it's going to have to start not only readmitting Chinese students, but treating them decently and cultivating the attitude that, while you can go to the United States, you can be treated respectfully, not treated any differently from anybody else, but on par with how every human being should be treated, whether you're in your native country or a foreign country. And that will go some way to enabling the United States to repair its relationship with China. But the idea that it's going to sit there and say we want rapprochement and we want to sign these deals and we want to work and cooperate with China, but in the next breath, oh, by the way, we're going to enforce this if you don't do what we tell you, it's just not going to wash. And therefore, they in China regard Trump's attitudes as not just necessarily Trump having a tantrum, they regard it as being delusional. They regard it as being ridiculously childlike behavior that is not going to reap any benefits for either country. And, if the United States doesn't want to play ball, then China will just take its ball and go and work with some other country who in the future wants Chinese rare earths, wants China's magnets, wants to be able to develop technologies themselves because they have the resources to do that and they can have value-added chains within their own country, which is something the West has exploited and prevented, Africa being a great example of this, for as long as we care to remember, hundreds of years, but particularly, I would say, since the Industrial Revolution. And this, therefore, gives China huge leverage with respect to not just the United States, but also gives them leverage in the sense that the rest of the world, the global south, is looking at them going, well, they're standing up for the rights of not just China, but for other nations like ours. And therefore, on that basis, we think that is the better relationship for us to be in the future and not to actually be a vassal state of the United States, as we have been, particularly since World War II.
I think one of the hardest things, and I'm going to just give my opinion on this, but I think it's already beyond the scope during this Trump administration for the next three and some odd years, is he is just not able, his disposition and personality to be able to switch when it comes to foreign policy, dealing with Russia, China, India as an equal. Back in the day when the BRICS whole thing started, China and Russia and the BRICS wanted to work with the United States as an equal. Come join us, make the world a better place overall. But unfortunately, those who were in power were primarily corrupt, and they just saw ways to exploit it. Whether it was, during the Obama administration when the Clinton Foundation was buying uranium or making deals with Russia, whichever way to make a buck, it didn't matter. Then we move forward to uh, the second thing. You either then, as the Trump has tried to do, is use belligerence or aggressive nature. We're going to tariff you into oblivion. We're going to, make these demands. We're going to not support, sorry, the not support the intentions that you guys have, and that has failed. So what's left? What's left is the United States and Europe are having now to go to China and the rest of BRICS hat in hand, and that is something that President Trump and his ego can never do. He has to see everything as a win rather than a win-win or a loss. And so I don't think like I said, his disposition of having to win, making outlandish statements about he's ended 10 wars in just the 7 months he's been here. This is really going to hinder the United States' ability to work with countries like China and Russia to try to make the world as a whole a better place. It's us versus them mentality, and that's no different than what we had during the old Cold War days of the Soviet Union and the United States.
Yeah, absolutely. And just a final point on this, it's playing into the hands of the global south, of the Chinese, of the Russians by saying, we've always warned you, you can't trust the United States. They're not reliable partners. They will threaten you. They will coerce you. And then Trump plays exactly into into the hands of that role of going, well, if you don't do what we say, we'll tariff you. They've stopped using the word sanctions because I think finally the Trump administration has wised up to the fact that sanctions don't work. The Europeans have, and I have no idea how long it's going to take them to work out that sanctioning Russia is meaningless. But the United States has worked that out, but instead they go, no, tariffs, not actually even understanding what tariffing foreign imports or foreign exports to the US does. In fact, it harms the United States, not them. But it plays into the hands of the Chinese who say, look, you're demonstrating consistently. You have an aggressive posture. You have a posture of threatening nations. You're trying to tell us how to conduct business and who we can conduct it with. The global south sitting nodding along, going, well, yes, this is why we don't want to work with the United States, why we want to de-dollarize, why we are no longer prepared to tolerate this behavior, because collectively we feel secure and strong in our ability to withstand that kind of abusive relationship with you. The United States, whereas previously we felt isolated and couldn't stand up to them, well, now we can. And the US needs to just finally sit there and go, well, this isn't working. So we're going to have to change. And we're going to have to realize that the world's moved on. And in order for us to thrive in the future, we're going to have to move with the world and not move against it. Because if we continue to move against it, all we're doing is creating ourselves more and more problems, isolating ourselves and accelerating our own demise. And more crucially, we're not going to have those relationships with those countries to help us rebuild the United States into a first world economy, which it currently isn't anymore to all intents and purposes. And that's critically the part they're missing. So it comes back to the point that the United States can try and hardball China. China's just going to ignore it. And the United States just looks more and more desperate and pathetic. That if it's an hegemonic power, it doesn't have to stand there threatening countries with these idle postures and idle gestures that China can turn around and go, fine, well, we'll do this. And then the United States actually is on the receiving end of a major problem that it can't rectify unless it indeed changes its attitude and starts to behave like an adult, basically.
Very well said. Paul, was there any other final thoughts you wanted to add to this?
No, I think that's fine.
To everybody here at the Sirius Report community and to all the new subscribers that have signed up in recent days, thank you as always for your support. Don't forget to like, share, subscribe, comment, send this out to anybody you think it might be important to. And until the next time we get together, have a great day.